September 1949. The heat of the late Washington, D.C. summer lingered, but inside the cramped, echoing newsroom, the atmosphere was already turning frigid. Beneath banks of harsh fluorescent lights, men in rolled-up shirt sleeves moved with the confidence of those who controlled the global narrative. The dominant sound was the incessant rattling chatter of the teletype machines. Each machine was a nervous system, pumping out raw, unvetted information from every corner of the planet. For 4 years, those machines had confirmed America's status as the sole master of atomic power. The Soviet Union was a formidable military threat, but technologically inferior, lagging decades behind. This monopoly was the foundation of the post-war world order, the ultimate deterrent against global conflict. Then, the machines began to stutter. In a quiet corner office, a photo editor named Sam unrolled a glossy print onto his light table. He had received the print via a clandestine chain of contacts, officially credited only as foreign source, top priority. It was a piece of high-quality, large-format paper, still slightly damp with fixer. The image dominated the surface, stark black and white, perfectly composed. It showed the sky cleaved by a titanic force. Rising from a scorched, empty earth was the iconic, unmistakable shape of a mushroom cloud. It was a massive, terrifying stalk of dark vapor, topped by a churning, incandescent cap of impossible geometry. The scale was overwhelming. The cloud towered above the horizon line, casting a deep, absolute shadow across the terrain below. It was a silent, vertical monument to total power. The cloud had a definitive, almost sculptural look, the terrifying perfection achieved only by nuclear forces. Sam slowly traced the edge of the fireball with his finger. The silence in his small office was abruptly broken when a senior managing editor peered over his shoulder. "Where in God's name did that come from, Sam? This isn't a test site. This isn't Nevada." The question hung in the stale, charged air. The American atomic tests, the familiar sites of Bikini Atoll and Trinity, had a known visual signature, a recognizable geography. This photo had none of that. It felt foreign, utterly isolated, and unnervingly successful. It was proof, presented without context, that the impossible had happened. The teletype machines suddenly stopped chattering. All eyes in the newsroom turned to a clerk who held a freshly printed sheet of Associated Press wire copy. The headline, transmitted from the White House, confirmed what the visual evidence already screamed: the Soviet Union had tested an atomic weapon. The official scientific confirmation of a Soviet blast came from radioactive debris collected by American atmospheric flights days earlier. A silent, invisible, chemical fact. The world, however, did not react to atmospheric dust. The world reacted to the image. The glossy print of the towering cloud became an immediate flashpoint. It transformed an abstract scientific reality into a visceral photographic truth. It gave the invisible fear of nuclear parity a terrifying visible face. This single, isolated photograph, regardless of its true source or ultimate authenticity, instantly changed the geopolitical balance. It convinced the free world that the Soviet adversary had achieved unstoppable parity, immediately demanding a massive and costly counter-response. The 4 years following the end of the Second World War were defined by a single, overwhelming certainty: the American atomic monopoly. This was the ultimate political currency, the defining factor in every global negotiation, and the bedrock of Western confidence. The existence of the Soviet Union as a hostile power was accepted, but the United States held the single deterrent that mattered. The power of the atom was an exclusive American right, guaranteed by Manhattan Project secrecy and presumed Soviet technological backwardness. However, behind the sealed borders of the Soviet Union, a colossal, desperate enterprise was underway. This project was driven by 2 entirely different men: the scientist, Igor Kurchatov, and the security chief, Lavrenti Beria. Kurchatov, the brilliant physicist, was responsible for the technical puzzle, the calculations, the neutron physics, and the engineering of the bomb itself, codenamed RDS-1. Beria, Stalin's ruthless head of the NKVD, predecessor to the KGB, was responsible for the pace, the security, and the sheer, brutal logistical force that compressed a decade of work into 4 frantic years. The Soviet effort was a monumental act of scientific theft and forced industrialization, motivated by an existential fear of continued American atomic exclusivity. The success of their test on August 29, 1949 in Kazakhstan was not immediately visible to the world. It was an event concealed by the vast emptiness of the Soviet steppe and shrouded in layers of military secrecy. The truth of the blast was not found by a spy or a satellite, but by a handful of specially modified American long-range bomber aircraft flying routine air sampling missions over the Pacific. These planes, known as Project Silverplate, carried highly sensitive filters designed to detect atmospheric changes. The crew of a WB-29 Superfortress collected the evidence, microscopic particles of radioactive debris known as fallout. These particles, ejected from the Soviet blast, were carried on the high-altitude jet stream across the Pacific. When the air filters were analyzed in a New Mexico lab, the proof was undeniable. The specific isotopes present, plutonium-239 and various fission products, were the unmistakable chemical signature of a controlled, powerful nuclear detonation. This detection was a masterpiece of cold, invisible science. The facts were certain, verifiable by mathematical calculation and isotopic signature. But scientific fact, isolated in a laboratory report, was too abstract to ignite public consciousness or fundamentally change political doctrine overnight. The politicians and the press required something immediate, visual and visceral. They needed an image that could instantly convey the total loss of America's monopoly. The invisible fact of a fission signature in the atmosphere had to be translated into the terrifying visual certainty of a mushroom cloud on the front page. The silent confirmation of nuclear parity was a crucial historical note, but the visible myth of the photograph was what truly began the Cold War. In the Soviet Union, the success of the RDS-1 test was a matter of internal pride and external projection. While the world's scientific community was convinced by the atomic signature in the air, the political aim required a grander statement. In a heavily guarded photographic laboratory outside Moscow, propaganda officers received directives to create a visual statement of parity. They accessed the raw footage taken of the RDS-1 blast. The internal documentation showed a magnificent, yet specific, event. The initial Soviet design, closely modeled on the American Fat Man bomb, produced a powerful, destructive force. But visually, the Soviet military command wanted more. They wanted an image that stood shoulder to shoulder with the most spectacular American images, the towering water columns of Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll, or the perfect symmetry of the Trinity test. Officers extracted a single, powerful still frame from their own internal film. They began to work on it, manipulating the contrast, deepening the shadows, and, crucially, exaggerating the scale of the cloud to make it appear heavier and more globally impactful. The goal was simple: to choreograph a visual parity that screamed, "We are the same." This manufactured image, designed for internal celebration and carefully leaked as a piece of undeniable official Soviet truth, was a calculated instrument of psychological warfare. Meanwhile, a world away in Western newsrooms, a different kind of photographic deception was taking place, born of panic and deadline pressure. The moment the White House officially confirmed the Soviet blast, editors faced a critical crisis. They had the fact, but they lacked the picture. The invisible isotopes in the atmosphere could not be printed on a front page. In the archives of various photo agencies, news editors frantically scavenged for an image that could represent the cataclysmic event. They bypassed the grainy, distant aerial photos that intelligence agencies often supplied and settled on something familiar, terrifying, and visually proven: a stock photograph of a previous US test. It might have been the towering smoke column from the 1946 Baker test or a similar publicly available shot. In the rush of the moment, the image was selected, cropped, and slapped onto the plate. The caption beneath it simply read, "Soviet atomic explosion." The visual misattribution was complete. The propaganda officers in Moscow had fabricated a statement of power, while the desperate Western press had inadvertently provided the most iconic visual representation for their enemy. Two parallel darkrooms, one driven by political deception and the other by journalistic necessity, had forged the same instrument of global fear, a terrifying, misleading image of an unstoppable cloud. The initial reaction was terror, quickly followed by the cold discipline of intelligence. Deep inside the Pentagon's highly restricted analysis section, a handful of photographic analysts began to study the single glossy print that had dominated the news cycle. Their job was to move past the visual horror and find the measurable facts. The photograph was examined as a piece of geometric evidence. They placed the print under high-powered magnification. The scientists' reports from the air sampling flights had confirmed the plutonium-239 fission, proving the event was real. The image, however, was becoming a source of intense doubt. An analyst named Thomas traced the cloud's stalk. He noted a peculiar discrepancy in the shadow geometry. The cloud's base, where the vapor was still expanding from the initial blast, was too wide relative to the height of the column. Using established scaling models based on known American yields, the geometry suggested a cloud produced by a significantly smaller yield than the political implications suggested. It was a massive bomb, but perhaps not the technological giant the press proclaimed. Further analysis of the print, comparing the cloud's overall shape against known US test imagery, revealed subtle differences in the texture and the speed of the expansion lines. The composition, the way the cloud sat in the frame, the lack of immediate surrounding topographical evidence, looked almost too perfect, too staged. It had the polish of a publicity still, not the raw documentation of a military field test. The analysts looked at the image and saw two contradictory truths. A verified nuclear fission signature existed, but the single image representing that event was visually and geometrically misleading. The picture had been too ready, too clean. It was this visual and geometric analysis that triggered the first internal alarm within the intelligence community. The fact of the Soviet bomb was immutable science. The picture of the bomb was highly suspect visual theater. The analysts were forced to confront a realization more terrifying than the bomb itself. The political decision-makers weren't reacting to their lab reports. They were reacting to the newspaper headlines. The verifiable fact of the fission signature was now irrelevant. What mattered was the public myth of the photograph, a myth so powerful it had already created a new global reality. The picture, whether a lie or a distortion, had successfully forced the beginning of a conflict based entirely on the assumption of Soviet supremacy. The morning after the White House announcement, the argument was not whether the Soviet bomb was real, but whether the Western world should panic based on a lie. In the high-security briefing room, the poster-sized version of the photograph dominated the wall, becoming the silent antagonist in a debate between empirical caution and strategic necessity. The technical advisors presented their findings. The air sampling had confirmed the event, but the photo was a geometric impossibility. They used projector slides, overlaying the newspaper image with authenticated photographs of American tests. The comparison proved that the iconic cloud in the press was inconsistent with known nuclear blast physics. It was too symmetrical, too large relative to the presumed yield, and too visually perfect. The message was clear. This was likely either a recycled American image or deliberate Soviet propaganda designed to maximize fear and inflate perceived capability. The politicians and military strategists dismissed the geometry. Their counter-argument was absolute and based on the established visual realism cue the image provided. The public, the allies, and the adversaries were already operating under the assumption that the photograph was the definitive proof of Soviet technological equality. The strategic calculus was no longer about the actual yield of the RDS-1 device, but about the political consequences of the public belief in the image. The decision-makers found themselves trapped between the facts in the lab and the fear in the public square. They knew the bomb was real, but they also knew the image exaggerating its scale was forcing their hand. To deny the visual power of the photograph now, or to explain its geometric flaws, would only cause confusion and appear weak. The only viable path forward was to act on the worst-case scenario the image presented. The consensus, driven by political necessity, crystallized. The West must immediately accelerate to the next, overwhelming level of deterrence. The call was made to abandon incremental research and begin the full-scale development of the thermonuclear device, the superbomb, starting a race to achieve a parity that may not have even existed yet. The photograph had won. While the political machinery, now irrevocably set on a course for escalation, was already grinding forward, the scientific confirmation process quietly ran its course. In the classified subterranean laboratories, analysts meticulously processed the last remaining filters from the airborne WB-29 flights, working with an academic rigor that seemed entirely disconnected from the geopolitical storm raging outside. This final chemical trial was the ultimate judge. The scientists did not need a picture, they needed the elemental decay products. They boiled the filter papers down, separating out the trace materials embedded in the plastic fibers. The sophisticated equipment measured the precise half-life and atomic mass of the resulting material. The results were conclusive. The debris confirmed a successful plutonium fission detonation. More precisely, the distinct ratios of isotopes like plutonium-239 and strontium-90 allowed them to calculate the device's approximate yield. It was a powerful, successful blast, a profound technological achievement for the Soviets, proving parity was real. This verification, however, arrived too late to influence the initial, momentous decision. The irony was absolute. The precise language of physics confirmed reality after the misleading imagery had already defined the necessary response. The invisible isotopic evidence validated the existence of the threat, but the exaggerated cloud image had already determined the nature and scale of the Western reaction. The scientists delivered an accurate report to an empty room. The policymakers had already rushed out to respond to the newspaper headlines. The sequence of events became a profound, immediate lesson for the emerging Cold War. The scientific truth of the Soviet bomb, precise, measurable, and certain, lagged weeks behind the picture of the Soviet bomb, which was dramatic, compelling, and strategically manipulative. This confirmed the grim Channel theme, that the truth in the nuclear age would always be struggling to catch up to the picture. The reaction was immediate, visceral, and global. Across the United States, a deafening spike of fear drove the nation into a fever of preparedness. This was the moment the Cold War became a tangible sensory reality for every citizen. The noise was overwhelming. The incessant slam and roll of ink presses at the New York Times and the Washington Post ran all night, churning out banner headlines that solidified the image's power. Radios blared with urgent, static-laced updates. The sound of air raid sirens began to permeate drills in every major city, a chilling, rising and falling wail that felt less like a practice alert and more like an imminent death knell. The sheer physical noise of fear was the new background hum of America. On the streets, people moved with a nervous, hurried energy. Across suburbia, the most immediate, desperate response was the sound of shovels scraping concrete. Men and women, galvanized by the omnipresent image of the cloud, began frantically digging backyard shelters, turning manicured lawns into muddy, temporary graves. The materials were crude: plywood, cinder blocks, steel drums, but the activity was essential. It was a physical, almost ritualistic attempt to hide from the towering, inescapable mushroom cloud that now lived in their collective consciousness. Meanwhile, 6,000 miles away, in the immense stony expanse of Red Square, the atmosphere was defined by the deep, rhythmic, echoing sound of military parades. The Soviet state, reveling in the successful dissemination of its fabricated parity, transformed the event into a spectacular demonstration of triumph. Columns of infantry marched in perfect, synchronized step, followed by heavy artillery and the impressive, though often cosmetically maintained, armored divisions. The mushroom cloud, the very image causing panic in the West, was displayed on massive stylized banners, hanging like secular religious icons above the cheering crowds. The speeches were loud, echoing across the vast space, proclaiming the invincibility of the Soviet system and the final achievement of global technical equality. For the Soviets, the image was not a source of fear but a badge of pride, a tool of deterrence that finally neutralized the American monopoly. The contrast was absolute. Two nations, focused on the very same colossal, iconic cloud, experienced opposite emotional peaks. One paralyzed by absolute existential terror, the other energized by absolute self-proclaimed power. This shared visual yet divided meaning formed the first crucial psychological boundary of the Cold War. In the aftermath of the September panic, both superpowers made a crucial, silent observation that transcended mere intelligence gathering. Images move policy faster and more profoundly than reports. The grainy photograph, regardless of its authenticity, had achieved what countless diplomatic cables and scientific papers could not. It had instantaneously forced the most drastic policy pivot in American history. This realization immediately became strategic doctrine. The mushroom cloud was no longer just a byproduct of a test, it was a weapon itself. Both nations began refining not only their bombs but also the choreography of their subsequent detonations. The Soviets, learning their lesson from the success of the leaked imagery, began engineering their future test sites for maximum visual spectacle. Later tests were meticulously planned to produce the tallest, most dramatic condensation columns, ensuring that any aerial or peripheral photography would capture a terrifying, overwhelming symbol of power. They understood that the perception of magnitude was more valuable than the measurable yield. The Americans responded in kind. When the first true thermonuclear device, Operation Ivy Mike, was detonated in 1952, the military was determined to leverage its visual terror. The test, which vaporized an entire island and produced a mushroom cloud wider than the state of Rhode Island, was extensively filmed. The footage was carefully edited, transformed from scientific record into a devastating propaganda piece designed for global audience consumption. They televised the footage, sending a message of overwhelming, unmatched, destructive force to every corner of the world. The mushroom cloud ceased to be an image and became an aesthetic. It was printed on military doctrine manuals, plastered on anti-nuclear protest signs, and became the central motif in every Cold War thriller. It was the visual shorthand for Armageddon. The cloud's geometric perfection, its terrible beauty, made the abstract concept of nuclear annihilation instantly accessible and marketable as a concept of total power. It was this shift that defined the strategic standoff for the next 50 years. The core truth became clear. Deterrence wasn't written in treaties first. It was photographed. The terror sparked by the single glossy print was not ephemeral. It was systematically translated into raw, quantified escalation. The fear that the Soviet Union was already equal forced the United States into a massive, immediate industrial mobilization that dwarfed the original Manhattan Project. To illustrate the sheer pace of this reaction, consider the numbers. In 1949, the year the photo hit the press, the United States possessed a relatively modest atomic stockpile of around 170 weapons. By 1955, spurred entirely by the imperative to outpace the perceived Soviet lead, that number had ballooned to over 3,000. By the 1960s, the US inventory would exceed 18,000 nuclear devices, while the Soviet Union, driven by the need to catch the ghost of parity it had initially manufactured, raced just as frantically to follow suit. This rapid, exponential expansion played out in factory reels shown to Congress. Images of assembly lines dedicated solely to building plutonium cores and fission triggers. They showed vast new production complexes, dedicated to the manufacture of missile fuel and warhead casings, built deep beneath the American heartland. The emotional perception of the threat, the visual terror of the cloud, had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, fueling an arms race built on an image more than verified intelligence. The emotional perception was then translated into geopolitical consequence through maps. Military planners began using stark overlays of blast radii superimposed onto major world cities. They calculated the hypothetical death tolls for Moscow, for London, for New York. The psychological effect of the photo made every corner of the globe feel exposed. The abstract concept of nuclear war was now geographically specific, rendering the entire planet a potential ground zero. This frenetic build-up, the constant acceleration, the massive budget allocations, the deployment of thousands of warheads, was the ultimate, quantifiable proof of the image's power. The intelligence reports that followed in the months after September 1949 often corrected the initial Soviet yield estimates downward, suggesting the bomb was less powerful than feared. But by then, it was too late. The emotional, uncritical reaction to the image had already committed billions of dollars and countless resources to a state of perpetual high-alert readiness. The fear had manufactured the very escalation it was meant to prevent. The most astonishing detail of this world-changing event is that the photograph which dominated front pages and forced the acceleration of the arms race was, in all likelihood, a lie. Decades later, when the true internal Soviet archives became partially accessible, analysts performed the definitive forensic examination. The evidence points overwhelmingly to the fact that the iconic image distributed by Western media as the Soviet atomic cloud was almost certainly a recycled photograph from an earlier American test, likely a frame from the 1946 Operation Crossroads Baker test at Bikini Atoll. A side-by-side comparison reveals the truth. The contours of the cloud, the specific turbulent patterns in the stalk, the composition and the shadows are virtually identical to publicly available US military photography. The Soviet intelligence operation, whether by deliberately leaking a high-quality manipulated image or by allowing the Western press to frantically use a stock image, achieved its goal through deception by proxy. When the authentic, unmanipulated photos of the RDS-1 detonation were finally declassified by the Soviet successor states, the difference was immediately noticeable. The actual cloud was impressive but less geometrically perfect, less stylized, and visually less imposing than the image that had terrified the world. The authentic RDS-1 cloud lacked the manufactured spectacle of its doppelganger. The truth, once again, was irrelevant. The damage was done, the race was begun, and the fear was institutionalized. The final damning summary is this. The world feared a picture before it ever saw the truth. It remains the most potent example of visual information defining reality rather than reflecting it. The story of the 1949 photograph is the story of modern conflict. It's a perfect historical demonstration of how fear can be choreographed and how perception can overtake empirical data. In 1949, the world didn't need evidence, it needed something to see. And once the visual was supplied, all other information, no matter how scientifically sound, became secondary. The image was immediate, visceral, and required no technical interpretation. It was a single, perfect symbol of annihilation that the human mind could instantly process and react to. We see echoes of this foundational moment today. The grainy cloud has been replaced by the instantaneous dissemination of satellite leaks and the surgical precision of AI deepfakes. Modern information warfare is still fought on the same battlefield, the visual, immediate, and unverified image. Whether it's a manipulated aerial photograph of a supposed enemy deployment or a high-quality video designed to provoke political unrest, the mechanism remains identical to the one that terrified the press rooms of 1949. The goal is to force a preemptive, fear-driven reaction, leveraging the speed of the visual over the slowness of verification. The final, essential lesson of that first Cold War image is that the vulnerability was never in the intelligence reports, but in the human impulse to believe what is seen. We are designed to react to spectacle, and the world's most powerful actors know it. The camera, not the fissionable material, was the real trigger. We fade from the grainy, stylized cloud of 1949 to a modern digital waveform on a newsroom monitor, displaying a suspicious image being analyzed in real time. The anxiety is the same, only the medium has changed. The photo didn't start the Cold War, our belief in it did.